Encara no són 2:15, eh? Sí? Welcome, dear colleagues, dear friends, to this second keynote session as an additional program to the 15th edition of the International Congress on Musical Signification that we are broadcasting from the Escola Superior de Música de Catalunya in Barcelona. We're very sorry that we suffered this electronic breakdown yesterday, which prevented us from broadcasting the keynote as it was planned. So I'm presenting now the session that was meant to take place yesterday evening, and then afterwards at 6, Luca Chiantore's lecture recital will take place as it was planned. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you this wonderful session on teaching musical meaning to teenagers by Dr. Joan Vidal and Mark Horn that I will introduce to you briefly. Joan Francesc Vidal i Arasa has a degree in musical language, composition and musical pedagogy. He has also a diploma in advanced studies and a master's degree in research on music didactics from the Autonomous University in Barcelona. His master's thesis, Musical Learning with Cooperative Learning Methods, questions the student-teacher relationship in favor of a meiotic approach. Meiotic means here the traditional Socratic mode of inquiry, which aims to bring a person's latent ideas into clear consciousness. Joan Francesc is a professor of harmony at the Conservatory of Tortosa and of didactics of music in the degrees of education at the University Rovira i Virgili in Tarragona. His discovery of the book Music and Senses, An Introduction to Musical Meaning, meant a turning point in his teaching career. The book made him question the basics of the conservatoire curriculum. From the academic year 2018-19 on, he's been introducing musical signification into the professional degree of music conservatoires, advised by Joan Grimalt. That's me. Second, Mark Horn is a flute teacher at the Conservatory in Tarragona. He was trained at the Liceu Conservatory, at the Hogeschool voor de Kunsten in Utrecht, and in a pedagogic methodology based on improvisation. Mark's professional experience has led him to be part of the faculty of other centers throughout Catalonia, such as Tortosa, Reus, Granollers, or Berga. He combines his teaching job with performing and as an artistic director of recordings. One of Horn's recent recordings has been qualified as Best Classical Music Album at the Independent Music Awards of the Independent Phonographic Union. So I remind you, you can participate through the chat channel of YouTube, and I will give the questions myself to the speakers. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, before starting this presentation, I would like to thank Dr. Joan Grimalt for the support, patience, and interest that he has put in this experience, key factor, so we can make music absentits at the Escola Conservatoria Musica Tortosa. Secondly, I would like to thank to the people responsible of the ESMUC and the 15th International Congress on Musical Signification for giving us the opportunity to make this presentation in the additional program, and for believing that this presentation will be up to the standards of this event. And finally, we would also like to thank all the community of professors at the ESMUC who are leading this change on the musical signification, making the ESMUC an international referent on this field, and also for making it possible for the 15th International Congress on Musical Signification to be held in Barcelona in June 2022. So here you can see the index of what we'll be presenting you. On the first part, we'll be talking about the methodological context prior to the change, cooperative learning, and how this works through two main pillars, the debate and creativity. On the second part, we'll be talking about how the historical basis of the musical signification has made us change all the curriculum, referent authors and bibliography for this change, and how this was planned and shown to the educative community. And on the third part, we will be showing you examples of different didactic materials, some old ones, some hybrids between the formalism and the signification, the ones that we've needed for the analysis and interpretation with signification, and the ones we've needed for the creativity with signification. And finally, on the fourth part, we will show you a didactic sequence centered on musical creation, a didactic unit about rhetorical analysis of a madrigal using cooperative learning methods in a digital telematic learning environment, and a conventional didactic unit structured following the problem-based learning methodology. On this first block, we will explain you how it was possible for the Conservatorio Tortosa to be teaching music sentits with the musical signification as a fundamental part of the curriculum. To answer this question, why teaching with signification, we will show you a previous innovative project. The goal is showing this symbiotic relationship that cooperative learning, debate, creativity, and musical signification have. This previous project is also related to the ESMUC. During the academic year 2004-2005, Dr. Javier Duque, chief of the pedagogy department at the ESMUC at that time, advised by Dr. José Tejada, who is didactics and educative organization professor at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, started a collaboration program that has as its main goal to boost innovative projects in music schools. As a result of this project, the Conservatorio Tortosa implemented the cooperative learning in different subjects of the GP program with students from 12 to 18 years old. After 17 academic years, this is a methodology that has been absorbed and normalized. We call it cooperative learning, but the members of the groups have a positive interdependency and interact face-to-face. All of them have an individual responsibility to learn, and they process all the activities in groups in a way that they develop different social abilities in addition to their musical competences. In this way, the student not just memorizes and reproduces knowledge, but they create it. Knowledge is dynamic. Their approach to knowledge is holistic. Their tools to learn are debate and creativity, and there's space for self and co-evaluation. Finally, students are active during the class and look both for self and group improvement. So, going back to the initial question, why teaching with signification? The answer is because it fits perfectly with the basis of cooperative learning, its basic elements, knowledge located in the debate, and the relationship between teacher and student, because on one hand, positive interdependency, which enriches collective discourse, making possible the negotiation between signified and signifier. These debates involve face-to-face interaction where several social skills are activated during the process of identification and negotiation of the meaning of signs, and where everyone's responsibility is to discuss with own criteria. On the other hand, because knowledge is dynamic and the teacher acts as a guide in a learning process where the student is active in class. Subsequently, research, after we started working with cooperative learning, in this case under the guidance of Dr. David Duran, director of the research group on peer learning at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, showed us that 1. Cooperative learning increases debate in class, and 2. Debate and creativity are fundamental tools in order to negotiate signifieds and signifiers during the learning process. In our experience at the Conservatory at Tortosa, after changing the curriculum from a formalist view to a one with musical signification, debate and creativity continued being the pillars of the learning process. If we compare the principal features of both the formalist and absent-teach paradigms, we can see that, referring to signifiers and negotiation of signifieds, before having musical signification in our GP curriculum, the negotiation on signifieds was centered in the formal historical dimension, relating them to the signifiers sonority and texture, harmony, melody, and rhythm. The negotiation of signifiers was purely quantitative, centered in their increase and decrease. Now, with a musical signification in our curriculum, the negotiation of signifieds is qualitative, so hermeneutical. Referring to symbolic interpretation and meaning, before, the symbolic interpretation had syntactical meaning as to synchronic chronological significance, that it happens in a specific moment. After, symbolic interpretation has diachronic chronological meaning that evolves during time, and communicative signification or semantic as to syntactical and morphological signification. Referring to knowledge control on the basis of Giorgio Agamben, with a change of paradigm, there is a liberation of the sonic dispositive or apparatus interpretation. The control of the music making executed by the academic formalist code widens with the historical view absent-teach with signification, where, for example, the contemporary I performer can interact with musical signification elements proposed by the classical I in an 18th century musical piece. This diachronical dialogue that allows us to build and rebuild our music speech in relationship with this historical context is related to and is part of the empowering pedagogy. As the absent-teach paradigm is not exclusive and embraces the formalist view, it was a key factor for the liberation of dispositives. In the academic year 2018-2019, we contacted the Theory, Conducting and Composition department at the ESMUC, asking for collaboration in order to organize a little musical signification workshop at the Conservatory at Tortosa. We contacted Dr. Joan Grimal, who very kindly agreed to come to Tortosa and invited the harmony teacher of our center to talk about the first Jornadas Absent-teach Symposium. This Absent-teach Symposium, organized annually by the ESMUC, has been a source of inspiration. On the first edition, we could listen to Irene Valle talking about transformational harmonic analysis, and we invited her to come to Tortosa and talk about it to our students. Also, after the first experience in rhetorical analysis during the academic year 2019-2020, we invited Dr. Ruben Lopez-Cano to come to our center to do a workshop about it. During the academic years 2019-2020 and 2021, Dr. Joan Grimal has been answering our doubts about analysis, which, by the way, there were a lot of them. And nowadays, thanks to his help, creativity and analysis from the 3rd grade to the 6th grade of GP, from 14 to 18 years old, are absentees. Now, on the second block of the presentation, we will show you the features of our curriculum with the historicist basis derived from the musical signification in our curriculum and the sources we have used in order to make this change. We will also explain you how this change has been designed and how we explained it to the educative community. And finally, we will show you a SWOT analysis with strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats we detected in this change of curriculum. The change of perspective in the historicist basis make us ponder upon these musical signs used by a composer in a specific historical moment. And as we saw before, this enriches the debate about the performance of the pieces, giving them signification. In this slide, we can see 3 characteristics of the change that we can summarize in a diachronic view of the speech and an approach with signification to contemporary techniques and materials of the studied and analyzed pieces. But we may ask ourselves, can also students enrich their compositions with signification? As this change is focused in music teaching and learning in order to make music, it is clear that, of course, they can. Otherwise, we would be limiting their musical competences. Thus, we also discuss about how and which materials composers learned with in order to develop their speech. In a nutshell, the historic basis influences on the didactical basis of the curriculum, since we are not only approaching the musical pieces from a performer point of view, but also boosting the use of these signs in their own compositions and, whenever possible, using contemporary didactic materials of the composer's side. According to the first feature, the diachronic view, it is necessary to place the signs in a timeline. We've always had big timeline murals in our classroom where we could place the pieces we analyze and all kinds of historical information that we'd work in class. Nowadays, with COVID restrictions, this is not possible, and we have been doing digital timelines that we check in class. In this timeline, we can see that although madrigalisms, rhetoric devices, and topoi, and expressive genres are signs that appear in a specific historical moment, they continue to be present afterwards, transforming or grouping in different signs. We can also see how they interrelate with composition techniques, with clausula and modality, harmonical counterpoint, Fortspielung, partimento, schemata, gallant style syntax, and with musical styles, doctrine of the affections, and instrumental genres. According to this second feature, an absentee approach, and in order to relate the musical signification to a stylistic context, we've used Musica e Retorica del Barocco, Music and Rhetoric in Baroque, by Dr. Ruben Lopez-Cano. Also, the principal source for the absentee approach has been Musica e Sentits by Dr. Joan Grimal, that we used to support didactic units with signification. The third feature implies the use of contemporary didactic material of the time of the pieces to be studied. The change of historicist perspective not only obliged us to introduce changes in the analysis curriculum, but also made us rethink the use of functional harmony on the first courses and introduce the partimento and the role of the octave as creative resource. During the first lockdown, we contacted Lucerna Faculty of Music professor Dr. Derek Remish to translate from English to Catalan his compendium of patterns from the 17th and 18th centuries in order to make them reference material at the Conservatorio Tortosa and restore the role of the octave in 2, 3, and 4 voices. In the case of the role of the octave in 2 voices, as we thought that the third course of the GP program might be the natural bridge between the monodical language content taught in the musical language subject and the polyphonic language and harmony, we decided to widen the contents with harmony, counterpoint, and partimento by Job Eisenman. We have also created specific materials based on historically based papers published by Elam Rotem at earlymusicsources.com. We've also used C.P. Bach's essay on the true art of playing keyboard instruments in its translation to Spanish by Eva Martinez Marin as a reference material of non-functional harmony. As didactic reference material to partimento, we've used the treatise on basso continuo by Kellner, although we have also combined it with others such as materials that Mozart used with his student Thomas Atwood. It is also important to have a proper plan for this change of curriculum, and so it is the communication to everyone involved in order to successfully convince everyone who might be doubtful and reluctant to this change. Involving renowned experts in both academic and educative fields has been crucial to guarantee the quality of this change. Both the new curriculum design and its presentation have been comprehensive. To the leadership team and faculty of the Conservatorio Tortosa, students, and Diputació de Tarragona, the public administration which the conservatory depends on. On this slide, you can see the redesigning plan for the harmony curriculum for GP3 course in order to replace functional harmony with partimento, in particular with the role of the octave with 2 voices. In addition, incorporating a didactic unit on musical signification, introducing semantic fields, a semiotic chart showing their relation and main markers. It is structured in 30 sessions, and you can see it indicated on every column the theory fundamentals and materials, exercises such as ear training, analysis, creativity, and weekly homework. In this slide, you can see how contents are sequenced in different courses. So you can see how our curriculum absentees affected it. As Dr. Joan Grimal says, the analysis with signification gives more color for performances. We wanted to symbolize this idea of color on this chart. References to Musica Santiz are in red, to Music and Rhetoric in Baroque are in green, those to the use of partimento, the role of the octave, and transformational harmony are in black, and in blue are those that have been changed due to the historicist change of perspective. Here you have a part of the material we used for the presentations to the faculty, leadership team, and administration. These presentations are brief and straight to the point and explain the change, the reference authors with a specific mention to the exceptional case of the ESMUC, and have realistic strategies in order to work together with this perspective. To finish this block, where we've seen the change of curriculum. In this slide, you can see the pros and the cons related to the change in favor of the Amsterdam learning. Starting with the internal origin positive items that we see as opportunities, having experience in innovation, cooperative learning already boosted creativity and debate as learning tools. The leadership team, the music theory department, and all the faculty believed in and supported the change. The responsible members of the public administration organism that we depend on have believed in this change and have helped to make it possible. Of course, being a pilot center gives extra motivation to students and teachers. We've had a substantial enrichment of vocabulary used in class, new alliances between music theory and instrumental departments, and has widened the repertoire we work on. Before, it was just centered in tonal music, and now we have it from the 15th to the 20th centuries. The internal origin weaknesses of the project are not having adapted material for the GP program. Vocabulary is new at the center and needs time to be normalized. Teachers are burnt out because of the overexertion due to the COVID-19 pandemic with all the digital changes evaluating students it provoked. External origin strengths come particularly from the ESMUC, musical signification implemented in the ESMUC, didactic materials professors have done, the possibility to participate in lectures at the Jornadas amb Sentit symposium, and the guidance we've had from them. About the external origin threats, we have the pandemic, the inertia towards formalism, the lack of understanding of new vocabulary, the lack of musical signification in entrance exams to bachelor's degrees. So, continuing with the third block, we will show you different examples of didactic material we've used. Representing the old materials, we'll be showing you cooperative scripts, didactic materials, which we called hybrid materials, which help us to change from the formalist paradigm to the musical signification, and new material for both meaningful creation and analysis. As an example of didactic materials previous to the innovation, here you have an example of cooperative script. These were organized by sessions and grouped together in didactic units. Cooperative scripts are used to create an interactional context, creating a favorable environment for the 5 elements of cooperative learning. In 2018-2019 academic year, these were gradually stopped being used, and this year they will not longer be used. Main features. 1, we set academic goals and interpersonal and group dynamics. 2, we set the kind of peer interaction. In this case, we set different expert roles. 3, activities were sequenced, setting the composition of the groups, couples, groups, or assembly. And 4, once the session is over, individual and group competence are evaluated according to the group dynamics and the pre-established academic goals. Previous to the innovation, we also had these feature maps showing styles from Baroque to Romantic. They were divided in different sections: composing procedure, sonority, structure, pulse, rhythm, movement, harmony, and melody. And the goal was to chronologically date the analyzed materials. In this slide, we can see that questionnaire. We can see a questionnaire for the audition analysis, musical textures chart, and at the bottom you can see 2 grid charts for the formal analysis. These 3 documents are thought to get used to the model of audition and score analysis used in the bachelor's degree entrance exam in Catalonia. We'll explain you the arrows and circles. The entrance exams to music college influence the GP curriculum in many ways, mainly because music college and university entrance exams are on the same time at the end of the academic year. And in our case, in order to have a more comfortable end of course, we work on the 6th grade of the GP curriculum until Easter. During the following months, students who want to apply to a music college train themselves with mock exams. And we use questionnaires as the one in the slide based on the few examples of entrance exams we have access to. This is where in the academic year 2018-2019 we introduced the first change to the absentee analysis. We widened the texture subsection of the section form of the audition analysis questionnaire with a textures chart where we could distinguish the ones with semantic meaning. Also, we added an extra line for textures or signs to these formal analysis grid charts. Creativity-wise, this year we started a new absentees curriculum for the 3rd grade of GP from 13 to 14 years old, with partimento analysis after Kellner method and relations with the rule of the octave in 2 voices. The 4th grade group of this year alternates these 2 points of view with partimento and functional analysis after Kellner method, relations with the rule of the octave in 2 voices, and functional harmony in 4 voices, and versions of triad chords. The 5th grade of the curriculum only uses the partimento and functional analysis after Kellner. Composition exercises are with functional harmony in 4 voices, and versions of 7th chords and schemata. The 6th grade of GP is with the old curriculum with functional harmony, secondary dominants, minor subdominant, and altered chords. Having the change of curriculum and starting the course with online classes, and as a precaution in the creativity field, we devoted the first sessions to consolidate what every group accomplished with the old functional harmony curriculum, having as a reference this functional harmony summary. In terms of the historicist change regards the use of materials and techniques for composing, we've used Dr. Derek Remenish's proposal. In his doctoral thesis, Fiddle Bass, Chorale and Fugue, teaching the craft of composition in Johann Sebastian Bach's circle, Dr. Remish reconstructs Johann Sebastian Bach's composing pedagogy using historic sources. On his website, he offers a great amount of resources in order to face improvisation, creativity, and analysis from a great amount of revised didactical materials from the 17th and 18th centuries. Also, on his Facebook group, Composition and Improvisation in Bach's Germany, he also stimulates a rich discussion on this field. To work in modality and clausula, we have created new didactic materials based on historical materials published by Elan Rotem at lamusicsources.com, always having the compendium of patterns from the 17th and 18th centuries published by Derek Remish as a reference material. The most I can make it. The most common composing exercises of the 3rd grade of GP are the invention in 2 voices following the rule of the octave, To widen the content of the compendium, we elaborated documents containing information and schematic summaries after harmony, counterpoint, and partimento by Job ESMUC. For the role of the octave in 3 and 4 voices, we use the compendium of patterns from the 17th and 18th centuries by directe and its translation to Catalan. All materials with signification were made after Musical Signification and mapping music signification by Dr. Joan F. Revising and updating materials was necessary. For example, those related to control of dissonance, non-harmonic notes, the use of schemata in composing exercises, and the sonata theory. To classify rhetoric devices and the parts of the dispositio, we've used Music and Rhetoric in Baroque by Dr. Rubén López Cano. For the doctrine of the affections, we've used Music and Rhetoric in Baroque, Musica y Sentits, and published papers by the Fundación Juan Marc. 6th grade music history has been transformed to signs, genres, and instrumental classical styles history. The following conceptual map, containing fields, subfields, styles, and topoi, and the topoi guide for each of the semantic subfields, were made of the treatise Musica y Sentits. These semantic fields topoi guides have an index that allows rapid and direct access to any topos with the definition, the markers list, and also links with YouTube examples. In this last block, we'll be showing you a didactic sequence on composing exercises, a didactic unit on rhetorical analysis on a matrical using cooperative learning, and finally, a conventional didactic unit on Beethoven's expressive genres following the problem-based learning structure. For the didactic sequence on composing exercises, you can see that we use the Google Suites Classroom for managing and evaluating different activities, and Noteflight, Kami, and DocHub for editing, listening, and correct the exercises. In the rhetoric analysis didactic unit, that you can see how cooperative learning is used thanks to a Google Chrome browser extension called Breakout Rooms that allows us to manage different telematic workrooms at the same time. Finally, in the introduction to the narrative analysis didactic unit, we can see how formal analysis is supplemented with sign analysis in order to articulate a narrative speech and relate it to an expressive genre. One of the positive consequences of last year's lockdown was the rapid adaptation to digital environments. In our case, the center's leadership team decided to use the G Suite platform for all the students and classroom to create, assign, and evaluate homework. For Harmony class, we included an external score editor called Noteflight. Unlike in choral style exercises, thus in vocal style and always with tempo as a semantic field, in these exercises, students can choose between choral or instrumental styles and semantic field. On this side, you can see the steps our third grade of GP students follow to write an invention in 2 voices. The first step is writing after the rule of the octave in two voices except. In this case, a descendant sequence with a suspended note 7/3 over an active bass, finalizing with a clausula on the two voices. The chosen semantic field was dance, that's why the sarabanda rhythm is used. The second step is identifying the different movements on the voices in order to activate the dissonance control. The third step, ornamentation with non-harmonic notes, in this case only in weak beats. Following with two more examples by students, we can see that example 1 has two parts. The first part is made after the Romanesca bass line, and the second part after the descending rule of the octave with suspended notes over a sequence 2/6 and active melody. Semantic fields are unholy word for the melody and dance for the lower voice. Example 2 has two parts. One, on the first part, they use the ascending and descending rule of the octave, simple with thirds, and ornamented with the non-harmonic notes on weak beats. On the second part, they wrote a canon at the fifth after the descending 2/6-7/3 rule of the octave, alternating active voices. Here we have an example of fifth grade didactic unit. This didactic unit is an introduction to the analysis of rhetorical devices. We had 3 online sessions. The analyzed piece is the Madrigal Cruda Amarilli by Claudio Monteverdi. On the first phase, we made an approach to the material, working on the text and its translation to Catalan, looking for madrigalisms and identifying clausula and tuoni, and discussed about the concept seconda pratica after watching the video Artusi versus Monteverdi. The cooperative methodology we chose for this didactic unit is Puzzle 2. We identify 4 phases, and on each one of them, students are grouped in 2 different teams. First, in a homogeneous team where all of them work on a particular part of the content to be learned. After, they work in a heterogeneous team where there are as many students as parts has the content, and all of them show their part of the content and learn the rest from their classmates. Finally, all together in assembly, we elaborate an audiovisual document with the program iAnalyze. Here you can see a screenshot with a classwork of the second session where students work in phases 1 and 2. Students work in homogeneous groups and make specialist tasks on a particular part of the content and get ready to show it to their groups. In order to have an isolated room where specialists could work, we created 3 parallel rooms and work documents where they could enter using a link. One to work on repetition structures, another to work on hypothesis, and another to work on dissonance figures and chord figures. All groups had a summary of figures of speech and bibliography to widen information. In order to manage these isolated expert rooms, we used a Google Chrome extension called Breakout Rooms. To work with breakout rooms, we used two screens, one to see the rooms, in this case 3, and the other one to control the access to each one of them. From the control, we can listen to 1, 2, or 3 rooms and also speak to as many rooms as needed. It is actually very similar to how this work is done in classroom, with the advantage that the teacher is always in control, observing materials and listening to different groups. Actually, the intimacy given by the isolated room increases debate and participation.
Interpretativa. Eso los que están de programa. Com ara este, que és la, si, do, re, és una escala més senzilla i aquí ja fa com una brodatura superior. La, si, do, si.
On the third session, groups and roles change. They have to explain to their group what they have learned in the experts group and learn from their classmates the other figures of speech. In the end of the session and the didactic unit, they synthesize what they have learned on the previous sessions, and we create an audiovisual document with it. We'll show you the first 30 seconds of the analysis so you can have an idea of this document, what this document is like. The third example is a 2-session didactic unit. Classes are not online, and we use the problem-based learning methodology with the teacher acting as an expert assessor. A question is asked to the students: how does Beethoven achieve to establish a parallelism between the plot of the tragedy inspired on the Roman general and the music of the overture? In order to answer this question, students have to identify different signs and relate them to the formal structure. The discussion that follows will introduce the narrative analysis, allows them to articulate a speech in form of story and relate it with the expressive genre tragedy. The first step is to put the piece in a historical context and discover its plot. On the second step, we formally analyze the piece. In this case, we need an extension on the sonata theory consisting in a modular 3-part exposition. To consolidate this new knowledge, students have a glossary and a test that guide them while discovering this typological sonata variant that was also used by Brahms and Schubert. The third step is to identify signified and signifier of several signs and on the piece. Glossaries with descriptions and madrigalisms, figures of speech, styles, and topoi markers are given. To insist on the narratives of the piece, there's an activity on the different meanings of several rests. On the fourth step, we discuss about the possible signifieds that project the interrelation between the signs and the formal structure. Then we present the discursive structure of 5 different expressive genres, and we discuss about which one would suit the work's story better. The fifth step is to create a shared audiovisual document with all the information. We'll show you the first 30 seconds of it. And finally, to end this presentation, we'll show you a 5-minute video that we made so you can see our school, students, and teachers. Thank you very much.
El projecte Música amb sentits al Conservatori de Tortosa s'inicia el curs 18-19. Consisteix en la incorporació en el currículum dels 4 darrers cursos de grau professional, dels 14 als 18 anys, el que en un àmbit acadèmic es coneix com significació musical. La significació musical ens capacita per identificar signes musicals i interpretar el seu sentit en el context d'una obra musical. Ens aporta, per tant, sentits a la música, enriquint les nostres interpretacions i creacions. Aquest projecte ha estat possible gràcies a la transferència de coneixement des de l'ESMUC, l'Escola Superior de Música de Catalunya, a l'Escola i Conservatori de Música de Tortosa, i ha estat vehiculat a través del doctor Joan Grimal, professor del Departament i Teoria Musical de l'ESMUC, i reconegut expert en la matèria, que ha actuat com a assessor de Joan Vidal, professor d'harmonia del nostre centre, durant el procés d'incorporació de la significació musical al currículum de grau professional.
Bàsicament ha sigut una manera diferent de veure la música, ja que no se centra potser en coses tan visuals o tan esquemàtiques com havíem fet tota la vida, i és una manera d'interpretar la música des del punt de vista també dels autors que l'han escrit i també des del punt de vista històric i en el context en què es va composar.
Per a mi ha sigut una experiència molt xula, evidentment per tot el que comporta el conservatori, d'aprenentatge musical i d'amistats que se fan, però a més que hem pogut tindre l'oportunitat d'incloure aquest nou tipus d'anàlisi que per a mi, ostres, és com una manera de descobrir la música des d'una altra perspectiva, no? I a mi m'ha agradat molt i per això he fet el treball de recerca en aquesta temàtica i he fet diverses coses en relació amb això.
Aquesta nova experiència que ens han portat en aquesta anàlisi de sentits ha significat una forma d'aprendre diferent a com la teníem posada abans, i bé, jo crec que ens ajuda també a simplificar molt la música i veure-ho des d'una perspectiva més àmplia o més personal, potser tot.
La peça que toco és una peça del romanticisme de Briot, que bàsicament ens explicaria el que és un arquetip narratiu, és a dir, una estructura narrativa a través de la música, de lo tràgic a lo triomfant. Llavors, a través d'una estructura una mica rara per a l'època, ja que intenta ser com clàssica, però realment, en comptes de fer exposició, desenvolupament, exposició, que seria un tema, el desenvolupa, i després el torna a repetir el tema del principi però una mica més modificat, fa 3 parts però cadascuna és un tema diferent, per dir-ho així.
La veritat és que ha sigut una experiència molt xula, ja que el treball que vam anar a presentar vam aprofitar que és el treball de recerca que ens fan fer segon de batxillerat, i a través d'aquí del professor del conservatori vam poder fer aquest tipus d'anàlisi, i la veritat que l'experiència d'anar allí a l'ESMUC, poder-ho presentar, que gent que en sap d'això te digui la seva opinió, també que vam estar molt ben acollits i tot, va ser una experiència molt xula, i la veritat molt enriquidora.
Molt bonica, la veritat, jo vaig xalar molt allà perquè és una manera de dir, ostres, estic fent alguna cosa que m'agrada i fer-ho que el conservatori després explotar-ho i portar-ho a fora i presentar-ho, que també és experiència que guanyes al final presentant treballs, presentant a gent que en saben, que són professionals de l'Escola Superior de Música de Catalunya, i després evidentment és la cirereta del pastís de dir, jo he fet un treball, me l'he treballat molt i ara l'acabo i el presento en un lloc en renom.
Crec que va ser una experiència bastant enriquidora, tant a nivell personal com a nivell musical, crec jo, perquè a més de tenir l'oportunitat de presentar l'anàlisi a persones que en sabien, també va ajudar a donar una mica més de veu al Conservatori de Tortosa i que veiessin que alumnes més joves també podien fer presentacions d'aquest tipus.
Els efectes més immediats que notem són una ampliació en el discurs de l'alumnat en relació a les obres que interpreten. I també s'aprecia que s'estan obrint canals de comunicació entre les diferents assignatures que conformen el currículum, on es parla de creació, d'interpretació i del seu sentit.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Joan. This was quite impressive. I will need some time to digest all this information that you've given. It's quite a lot. In any case, there's quite a couple of very interesting questions about the performative part of the curriculum. What could you tell us about how this teaching method goes into the instrument classes, into how are instrumental teachers involved in the program?
De fet, la primera experiència que vam fer va ser gràcies a tu, que vas vindre a treballar en grups de cambra, no? Que teníem formats al centre sobre el repertori que feien els alumnes, no? I quan al final del quadrimestre tenim que fer ja les presentacions de les obres, tu vas fer una revisitació d'aquestes obres des de la perspectiva de la significació musical. Després, molt del repertori que a classe utilitzem és repertori que ells estan tocant. O sigui, nosaltres ens nodrim del repertori dels professors d'instrument. I de fet heu pogut veure al currículum, al vídeo que ara hem presentat, que ja estem entrant fent experiències de classes híbrides. Que per exemple es veia al vídeo que ve el professor de guitarra a presentar una obra, era una pavana, que en aquest cas havíem fet l'anàlisi des de la perspectiva de la classe col·lectiva i entrem ara en debats sobre quina seria la interpretació que ell proposava. Però sempre amb molta mesura, amb molta precaució i sempre intentant complementar la feina de la tasca del professor d'instrument.
Okay. I will try to translate this. It shouldn't be me because he's mentioning me all the time. First thing he said is that it was me who went in the first time to the conservatory, which is true, and we were working with some chamber music groups. And then he said also that in fact the works that they are analyzing are the works that the students play. So it's analysis of their repertoire. And third, he mentioned also the fact that they're trying to make hybrid teaching progressively. So it's a work is being analyzed and at the same time performed. And performance and analysis are interacting with each other. We have some more questions. From Michal Biejuk, as far as I understand, the goal of his new method is to swap formal paradigm to something more close to emotivism in historic context. Am I right? A veure si tu traduir això. Diu, si ho entenc bé, l'ànim, o sigui, l'objectiu d'aquest nou mètode és de canviar el paradigma formalista a alguna cosa més pròxima a emotivisme en un context històric. És així?
És així, però puntualitzaria que no estem canviant un paradigma per un altre, sinó que estem ampliant el paradigma. O sigui, un paradigma d'un aprenentatge amb sentits inclou també l'aprenentatge formal i sintàctic.
Yeah. Beautiful. He says that we are not switching paradigms, but we are widening the paradigm. So we are adding some things to the formal aspect is not being excluded, it's just widened. And I, for my part, do not understand the term emotivism, but so I'm not sure at all what the question means. I don't think it will be emotivisme.
S'està referint a la part semàntica, no, del discurs, més que la part tècnica.
Okay, yes, maybe Michał means the semantic aspect of music. Here is Małgorzata Greiter. Dzień dobry, bon dia, sorry to have missed the majority of this very interesting speech. I hope to be able to replay it from YouTube. Yes, you will be able, Goshu. And from Brazil, thanks for sharing your work, it is amazing. Diu, gràcies per compartir la teva feina, és magnífica, és esplèndida. Okay. You could also, of course, ask something to our speakers if you wish. No? Clive McClelland says very interesting food for thought. Clive, no sé si te'n recordes.
Sí.
Diu, molt interessant, això és un aliment per pensar. I Miguel Ángel Fernández Vega diu, thank you very much for sharing such incredible effort and project. Which is the theoretical basis for the semantic ground of musical meaning? Moltes gràcies per compartir aquest increïble esforç i projecte. Quina és la base teòrica per al fonament semàntic de la significació musical?
Bueno, jo sobre la base teòrica no he estudiat, he fet recerca i tot el que he après ha sigut, com he ficat, no, a la presentació, a partir de Música en sentits, és el primer llibre que entra en introducció, després a Mapping Music, i a partir d'aquí tot el que vaig descobrint sobre el tema de la significació musical, que ja no entro ja en el tema teòric.
Clar, also the answer is he has been using my books, this is and he's not getting into the theoretical grounds of musical semantics, but since he's following my books, I might add to that my methodological foundings would be the hermeneutic efforts of such pioneers as Professor Konstantin Floros, Grabot Marta, Taras Tiero, or Robert Hatton, to name but a few. Michał would like to precise, when I say emotivism, I mean, for instance, auto-expression theory. Quan diu emotivisme es refereix, per exemple, a la teoria de l'autoexpressió. No sé si diu alguna cosa això, a mi no.
Però potser es referirà a la teoria dels efectes, però realment no entrem dins del contingut de la teoria dels efectes, sinó que anunciem quins són els efectes que els compositors utilitzaven, que és una manera molt atractiva d'entrar, sobretot a adolescents, no? Que descriguin quin és l'efecte que reconeixes aquesta música a partir dels signes que has analitzat.
Joan says that affections can be a very effective way to introduce students to musical signification, in that an exercise can be made to let them discover which affections are related to some definite music passage. Diu en Michal, aquest polonès, diu gràcies per la vostra resposta i presentació, quina llàstima que no puguem discutir això de viu en viu. No? Yes, it is a pity, Michal, but we will get a chance to do that next June, let us hope. Now, another question from somebody who is in the room, actually. How do instrument teachers feel about this new method? Have performers already experienced changes in their performances? Diu, els professors d'instrument com se senten amb aquesta nova metodologia? Els intèrprets ja han experimentat canvis en les seves interpretacions?
Hem fet algunes experiències prèvies que, encara que són poques i comptades, no és una metodologia que sigui encara de claustre, que els sorprès molt. De fet, els encanta als alumnes que les obres que toquen les descriguem a les classes d'harmonia, i tots volen ser els que al final de la classe diuen: escoltem la meva obra, dis-mos què estàs veient, quins signes, no? Per exemple, el tema de la doble temporalitat enamora als alumnes que tenen un repertori romàntic, de dir, ostres, és veritat, això és passat, això és present, no? Sobretot. Però és una qüestió que potser m'agradaria presentar en posteriors jornades i trobades de que sí, que ja sigui una metodologia, diguéssim, oberta, compartida.
Joan answers to this question that it is often the case that they're working at harmony class, they're working on some piece that they're playing, and that the students request analysis of pieces that they're performing, and that this would change the way they see the work and the way they perform it. Thank you very much for this very interesting speech. Moltes gràcies per aquest discurs tan interessant. Miguel Ángel respon, great references, thank you for your double answer. O sigui, li agraden molt les referències i moltes gràcies per la doble resposta. 17:37 anem bé, no? Cal que si podem deixar temps, no? No cal que pleguem, podem esperar, no? No cal que pleguem, podem esperar. És que ahir vam tallar moltes preguntes que després van sortir de gent que s'havien quedat amb ganes de dir coses, no? So, I think there's still time for you to put any questions that you wish and take advantage of these wonderful speakers. Magdaleno.
Aquesta pregunta que està fascinada amb la cosa i preguntava sobre el fet de treballar sobre música en directe a la classe. Si és una cosa que es fa,
Sí, sempre a la part, sempre que podem, aprofitem el repertori dels alumnes i els alumnes toquen i defensen la seva interpretació, si és possible.
It was a bit hard to hear you, but if the question was about working on live music in the class, was that?
Yeah, I just relate to you this I was curious about how it will develop when the pandemic time is over, and if in the groups of students working live at place, you will include working with live music, with instruments, somehow cooperating with the live sounds.
Va, ok. Va, està dient un cop acabi la pandèmia, com s'imagina, però també continuaria amb el tema, vull dir que és una cosa que es fa a tocar a classe. Sí. Well, he's saying that nowadays it's actually done. That's students pay in class and they analyze and make reference to the musical signification on the pieces they play. So after the pandemic, if this ends up at some point, it's going to be continue. It's going to continue like that.
Okay, doncs què us sembla? Deixem aquí. So, thank you very much for your questions and comments, for attending, and we'll have a short break and we'll continue at 6 p.m. local time, that is in 19 minutes, with Luca Chiantore's lecture recital. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Sí, que està allunyant totes les altres coses que s'ha fet real. No real, no? Sí. Coses que la pandèmia ha posat una manifesta i després problemes burocràtics. S'arrastraran allà d'aquest any. Bueno, en fi, res, o sigui, així de dir, que guai les tinc. Però bé, en fi. L'administració que tenim, potser, per exemple, hauria estat molt. Merda.
Però per què no? Com que faré soroll i vibrarà. Ja t'ajudo. Punt.
Això... Sí, no, però hem fet la prova tot, o sigui, està tot en ordre. Ara no s'ha d'anar més cap allà i els tacos que hi havia aquí són...
Deixa't allà un moment.
Que són una rosada.
Deixa't allà perquè no...
Trepitgem el que sigui. Això tecnologia puta, això és...
Nota.
Uf, això no, poca conya, Mitja carrera meva de tot això.
Què és? Pels fanals.
No, això són tacos de madera, de fusta i goma, però la realitat és que jo toco molt alt, jo no sé com es fa la gent, com toca habitualment.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to introduce one of the leading figures in artistic research. Dr. Luca Chiantore combines thorough artistic practice as a pianist with profound musicological insight and a maximum of academic rigor in a way difficult to match, let alone better. This twofold access enables him to grasp music not only in its technical relevance within the course of history, but also to understand all the nuances of its social and cultural significance, and, by just sitting down at the piano, translate all this knowledge into a performance that is as revealing as it is exciting. Apart from his groundbreaking history of piano technique and various publications about Beethoven and the writing about music, he now focuses on the pianist, composer, and piano pedagogue Hélène de Montgeroux, a woman who doubtlessly deserves much more attention than she gets, and not only because of her lifestyle, picturesque biography, and the mere fact of being a woman in an almost exclusively male context, but especially due to her compositions and piano playing, as you can perceive in this latest CD of Dr. Chiantore's. It goes without saying that Dr. Chiantore will now pull out on all the stops when letting us all partake of Orgasmatio, performance challenges and musical signification in Hélène de Montgeroux's Etude for Piano. Please welcome Dr. Luca Chiantore.
Thank you. Thank you, Rolf, for these kind words. And sincere thanks also to Joan Grimal and Tarasti, my dear colleagues, for this invitation, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to offer this concert lecture within the additional program of the 15th edition of the International Conference for Musical Signification, precisely from the ESMUC in Barcelona, this institution whose teaching staff have been a part of since its foundation to 2001. What I'm playing is a sample of one of 114 incredible piano etudes composed by an even more incredible woman in the 1810s. I will be performing 9 of these studies in their entirety today, featured on the recent album linked to my ongoing artistic research project, Inversions. In Hélène de Montgeroux, her music, her figure, and the crossed path between both dimensions are wonderful opportunities to rethink that era of revolutions. She actually composed very little, having devoted herself mainly to improvisation. And it is true that her most important creations are precisely these etudes, short pages published within a treatise on piano teaching, her Cours complet pour l'enseignement du forte piano. The extensive comments that precede each of these etudes, are a treasury for the study of that history of piano technique to which I have dedicated half of my life, and that this book is one of my more recent books. But it is not easy to talk about these gems without questioning the categories we usually apply to 19th century music, built around the fascination for long, explicitly stage-oriented works. The aspect that fascinates me the most about her music is precisely the impossibility of placing it comfortably into the image we currently have of the musical culture of that time. The etude I am going to play is an excellent example of this. It's based on a well-known compositional principle, the repetition of the same pattern in different chords, that came from the practice of partimento, the continuum we know so well thanks to Bach and his well-tempered clavier. But what is that the pattern used here by Hélène de Montgeroux harmonies by which Montgeroux carries it seems to take us not a century before this music was composed, but a century later. So much so that it is not inappropriate to rescue the term impressionism. Harmony fades, color invades everything, and the borders between tonal functions are blurred. Musically speaking, however, she seems to constantly defy this chronology. Now, if what I just played is stylistically so difficult to locate, it is not only because of Montgeroux's electrifying imagination, but also because of how I play her music, without, therefore, changing not one of the notes she wrote down. This is something unusual for me, because in my performances, I often modify the scores of the Western art music repertoire, starting from a creative use of both historical sources and the practice of the time. But not here. Here the challenge springs from the score itself. Anyone who has followed my recent writings knows how critical I am of the use we usually make of categories such as classicism and romanticism, which merged a posteriori in the name of a teleological vision of the history of music that I don't subscribe at all. Hence my effort to radically redesign their use, and hence also my interest in exploring the potential of performance in this subversion of the traditional stylistic and historiographic categories. As I claim in my book and articles, to reject the traditional subordination of performance to analysis and historiography allows discovering facets of the work able to generate new ways of creating discourse around the music. This is especially true with the following etudes. The following one, again, gives the feeling of combining very different words. It seems not far from a Lied ohne Worte by Mendelssohn, who anyway was 7 years old when this collection was first published in 1816, although some inklings suggested it was composed several years before. But the length of the lead line is typical of much later compositional trends. And the long, uninterrupted phrase breathing is not so much a way of articulation, diction, as an invitation to go on and on and on. Tchaikovsky and even Rachmaninoff seem to have left the mark here, while they were not yet born. And the piece ends with a chord whose long appoggiatura seems added by Mahler. again, regardless of what can be said when observing the score, performance can do a lot of highlight one element or another. And I consciously seek to underline those features that distance Alain de Montgeroux from the topical image of the woman who plays beautifully early romantic salon music that leaves us so accommodated in our idea of history, and also in a certain idea of feminine sweetness that so often aligns to our approach to the music of the women of that time, and that I drastically reject. As you may have appreciated, not only the final appoggiatura, but the main compositional pattern itself is of extraordinary interest in the piece we have just heard. The melody, from the beginning to end, does not coincide with the bass. It could have been the then traditional practice of asynchrony, which served to give certain notes as an expressive emphasis. The point is that here the asynchrony occurs all the time, not as a specific effect for some notes, and is integrated into writing, as it will occasionally happen again in successive authors such as Schumann, and in fundamental works of the piano repertoire of the late 19th century, such as Prelude, Chorale et Fugue by César Franck. This will happen in Schumann, Franck, and others. Here the rhetorical emphasis turns into color, accompanying us not only in the fascinating climax, but even in the most peaceful passages of this work. Well, the same ingenuity of writing, which turns certain rhetorical tricks into structural patterns, we find in the following incredible Etude number 45, one of those in which it's easier to speak of Alain de Montgeroux as a precursor. It's inevitable to imagine Robert Schumann while writing some of his best-known passages, taking inspiration from this piece published for the first time when Schumann was only 6 years old. When listening to pieces so full of elements typical of later times, it's inevitable to consider Montgeroux as a great forgotten, especially considering that in her day she was not a person away from the public eye. She was the most appreciated improviser in France. She was the first professeur de première classe at her recently founded Conservatoire de Paris, and her piano method continued to be used for generations, so much so that Marguerite Long, leading figure of the 20th century French piano scene, remembered working on those studies in Antoine Marmontel's class. But we already know how unforgiving oblivion can be, especially with women, a forgetfulness that began with people with whom she dealt directly and who did not recognize her merits. John Cramer seems to have been a student of hers, but then he never spoke of her. Schumann undoubtedly owes her a lot, but he does not dedicate one single word to her in his extensive activity as a critic. There is no mention of her in the letters the young Chopin wrote recently arrived in Paris or in Liszt men's correspondence, although it's more than probable that they met personally in that city. And if those people did not talk about her, the following generation forgot her completely. In addition, she was French, and we perfectly know how biased the construction of the Western canon has been and how focused on German-speaking figures. There are many possible gender approaches to Hélène de Montgeroul's music. Those that captivated me the most, beyond this undeniable historiographic offense, are the ones that connect performance with musical signification. That is why it's so interesting to talk about it here. It's daring of me, I know, given that I'm not a specialist in that field. My research focuses on piano technique and the history of musical performance, but I find it tremendously inspiring to share the following ideas with you, and I hope to talk about them again in 2022 in person. I'm talking about the possible general readings of her pieces, a thorny issue that forces us to inevitable triangulations, since this point appears only indirectly in the sources of her time, and even recent studies rarely applied to this repertoire. Let's think about the case of Etude number 35 that I'm going to play next. It addresses a very tangible manual problem, the rapid alternation of notes played by two hands. Hélène de Montgeroul chooses to combine two fast lines, but each one has its own personality, so much so that they could perfectly be two independent tunes. We find them constantly intertwined and punctually interrupted by respite moments in a playful chase in which the two lines clearly seek to understand each other without losing their individuality and even lightly provoking each other. As we all know, in the opera of that time, two lines in thirds represented an interpersonal harmony, just as unison was reserved to the full identification of ideas, intention, and actions. But two divergent lines used to appear to represent a disparity of characters and emotional situations, sometimes compatible, other times explicitly opposed. Here the lines move in thirds only punctually. They immediately diverge and then converge again, and all this in a devilish rhythm typical of an enduring scene of joyous bodily interaction. Was not only an extraordinary musician, she was also an extraordinary woman, literally out of the ordinary. Born in 1764 as Hélène de Nervaux into an upper-class family, the beginnings of her biography fit with the conventions of the aristocracy of the time. She married very young with the Marquis André Gauthier de Montgeroul, and that marriage augured a progeny with noble titles, properties, and a well-off life. But things went awry fast. The revolution came, and instead of ending up a victim of the Jacobin fever, the young Hélène became almost an emblem of how those times could be an occasion for personal transformation and surprising experiences. Her husband died a prisoner during the first years of the revolution, but not at the hands of the rebels, as used to happen to the aristocrats, but by the Austrian troops, after having gone over to the side of the new regime. public. And Hélène, still in her 20s, rebuilds her life. After traveling through Italy and Germany in a concert tour in England, she accepts the post of professor at the newly founded conservatoire, and she had a child. We don't know from whom. Her son, Charles Heath, the only one yet, will end up having the surname of Helene's second husband 2 years later, a marriage that was most likely an amicable agreement to guarantee the legitimacy of that child, to whom Hélène will remain closely linked until the last day of her life. Love for Hélène de Montgeroux was not necessarily linked to marriage. She had passionate relationships, the best documented of which was with Louis-Philippe Joseph Giraud de Viennet, better known as Baron de Trémont, a learned man, versatile artist, a diplomat who became Napoleon's right-hand man. A fascinating guy 10 years younger than her. As younger than her was her second husband, and it will not be the last. There will be a third, 19 years younger than her. The fairy Hélène de Montgeroux felt passion, desire, and the seduction of the flesh. In her letters you can see it perfectly, and in her music too. In what I'm going to play next, very fascinating aspects are combined in this sense. There are two etudes to combine an etude, actually just one, in two parts, that are part of a section of her method aimed at showing how to improvise cadences. The main theme of the first of these etudes seems typical of an opera by Paisiello or the young Rossini, but the register is unusually low. The sinuous expressiveness of female melodies is transferred to the register of masculine voice, seductive precisely because of how low it is. How fascinating bass voices are, right? Well, Hélène de Montgeroux seems to talk about how they can be seductive, strong, and at the same time sensual. And in the arpeggios of the middle part take us back to the most visionary moments in the production of Chopin, Franck and Fauré, a really wonderful piece which I especially love. I don't know which kind of song, perhaps mobile phone or something like this. Alarm, is it? Rhetorical stop for introducing this wonderful piece. And then another example of how to perform a cadenza, and in this case the eroticism of the proposal became even more explicit. It was after listening to me playing and commenting on this page on the Journal Substantique this year that the beloved and admired Ruben Lopez-Cano, so well known by all of you, coined the neologism that gives this lecture concert its title, Orgasmatio, as if it were a rhetorical figure. Here I only see Alain de Montgeroux representing love excitement in its highest expression. The key pattern of this etude combines an ancient declamation with its dotted rhythm in an ever-changing register, which alternates with repeated chords that offer a modulating, sinuous, harmonic representation of the suspiro, that sight that sometimes, in a very explicit way, becomes a symbolic amplification of the heartbeat of someone who is close to death, as in Strauss' Tote Verklärung. But it is not less true that death in Western culture has been once and again a metaphorical term to indicate orgasm. Here, growing excitement, anxious breathing, pulse acceleration within an increasingly chaotic tonal balance lead to a descending chromatic tetrachord, immediately followed by an explosion of fast notes that reproduces in an almost graphical way that climax and its more physical manifestation. A thrill, an upward impulse that turns into a liquid cascade of rapid descending notes, followed by another somewhat shorter analogous gesture, and another, and then the beginning of a dialogue and a quick interaction of friendly gestures. Is it over? Well, not exactly, because this is love seen from the feminine side, and nothing prevents you from starting over. Amanda Bonjour knew the pleasures of sex, and at the same time she knew the difficulties of being a free woman. And one of her etudes, number 62, seems the fair representation of that longing for freedom and of the difficulty of finding a dialogue with those low voices who oppose that with no other argument than no, you can't. From here on, it remains to be seen if what that male voice is perhaps that of little Helen Father, who must have been a whirlwind as a young girl, or perhaps one of her different husbands or lovers, because it wasn't easy for her to find the man who could understand her, or perhaps, in a more abstract way, society as a whole. In this etude, after a turbulent beginning full of unprepared ninth harmonies, a treble voice makes its way in a very high register, so high that I like to think that the beginning represents the girl, the pre-adolescent Helen looking for her way. And the answer is a relentless punctuator rhythm. Tam, ta-tam, ta-tam. No need to put words to it, right? Time goes by, the treble voice reaches a more typical register of a young woman, but the reply does not change. And so third time with a more settled tone, but the reaction is always the same, a sharp, authoritative response. At one point, a ray of hope springs up, a possibility of understanding, but no. The outcome is an arrogant denial of dialogue. And then comes the coda, in which the female voice does the only sane thing in front of this unreason. She says goodbye and walks away. She can go away, which is already a lot, and she does. And the low voice remains alone, repeating in an almost bewildered way the last notes of the female voice, as if he were reflecting on what she was actually saying from the beginning. Too late, obviously. the sensuality that Hélène Mogeroux claimed for her life can be found in the most unexpected places of her output. For example, in some etudes that are apparently true exercises or practice pieces as journeys, whose famous collections, anyway, were written long after the publication of Mogeroux's treatise. Well, she achieves that. These successions of notes clearly oriented to the resolution of a mechanic problem give life to sound proposal of great charm. This is the case of this tremendously difficult etude number 73, focused on a novel problem such as repeated notes at a time when the double escapement action, the double échappement, has not yet been patented. More specifically, it focuses on the rapid succession of the thumb and the forefinger on the same key. Well, Hélène Mogeroux makes this biomechanical problem compatible with bases that she herself defined as symphonic and really shocking harmonies. Listen to the very beginning, for instance, with that enigmatic C sharp that arrives without preparation outside of any counterpoint norm to give the initial D major chord a color typical of the generation of Fauré or even Dukas or Ravel. In the chords and the intervals used in these pieces, one of the most striking aspects is that Hélène Mogeroux practically never uses structures that can easily fit within the traditional formal models. Even when the main theme returns, for instance, it's always so transformed and developed that Montreal's etude seems an anthology of formal solutions that we often regard as characteristic innovations of later composers. The last etude I will play, number 111, is a good example of this, as the last one too. It is an especially challenging piece on the mechanical point of view, but also harmonically and formally. It's full of parallel fifths, false relations, and unprepared dissonances within a tonal plan that moves continuously in less than 3 minutes between G minor, C minor, E flat major, F minor, A flat major, and B flat minor, in a sonority we could perfectly attribute to authors like Schumann or even Brahms and Reger. Does the traditional narrative about the supposed succession of classicism and romanticism really works? And the discourses we have created around the correspondence of chronology styles? Here we have a woman who could suffice of her own to force us to rethink much of the path that historiography and analysis have taken so far. An uncomfortable woman, obviously, and in addition, rebellious in her behavior. We can continue to silence her, as we have done so far, not just with her, but with too many other artists. Or we can let her pervade our world with the freshness, the daring, the freedom of thought and action she displayed all her life. I am happy to have found her on my way, essentially thanks to the indispensable Jérôme Dorival, the musicologist, the author of this seminal book about her, the musicologist who is dedicating a lifetime of studies to her. And today, concretely, I am immensely happy to share with all of you this sincere love that I feel for her, from that distance of 2 centuries that vanishes in an instant every time I perform, like today, her music on stage. I say goodbye to all of you, or at least that you here finished this lecture concert. Actually, we're wishing to meet you all in a few months in Barcelona and in these splendid facilities to continue making our way in the name of music and culture, that culture our world needs so much. See you soon. course, if you have some questions or if there's someone in course, I don't have the connection with YouTube, but
okay, we have here in the chat a question by Mario Suominen, who asks, I wonder which pianos Hélène de Montgeroux might have played, Cristofori and or Pleyel.
No, Cristofori, no. At that time in France, the leading pianos were Pleyel and Erard. Undoubtedly were the main, in particular Erard were the most important piano makers. So and in England, undoubtedly Broadwood and all the different way. When she went in England in the 19th, the England piano scene were very active. We don't know exactly which we don't have any information, specific information about the preference, but more or less these kind of instruments in that time.
This actually does connect with another comment by Miguel Ángel Fernández, who says that Erard and new pedals made its contribution.
She was very active in being very sensible to novelties. For instance, the piano method is outstandingly in time using the new Metzel metronome that was invented 2 years before. In here, there's all the metronomes in all the studies, for instance. And she was very, in her commentaries also, were very interested in pedals, for instance, on the sensibility of the keyboard and the sense, this kind of attention to senses that, in my opinion, is so interesting, all in this erratical point of view, but is very, in my opinion, very connected to all this sensitivity in her explanation about each etude, almost one page of text of each one of these etudes. The whole the whole work is 771 pages, so it's a very huge treatise. And all the texts are so interested. For instance, there is one incredible descriptions of how important is the action of the muscles who are behind the palm of the hand. She was talking about the inner musculature of the fingers, not the extrinsic but the intrinsic musculature of the fingers. That was not yet discovered in the anatomy, but she felt that, and we already perfectly know that in piano technique the use of the inner musculature within the hand and not the use of the flexor and extensor, not just the flexor and extensor, is key, a key point of the piano technique. But she was describing that in terms of sensitivity of what is, as well as in bodily behavior and feelings. She used an incredible amount of diverse terminology for elasticity, flexibility, and relaxation, and souplesse, flexibility, elasticity. Each of these terms for her is a specific term. So that's an amazing attention to body and to the sensation of the body, and obviously through for piano technique. But it's of course it's a way of being as a human being. It's perfectly connected with her epistolary, with her behavior as a woman, as a person. In my opinion, it's amazing. I'm completely in love with her. Absolutely. I'm a bit late, but I'd like to appoint to the following husband. Now, it's true that, but it's almost the same for Joan F. Vidal. It's a so attractive woman that working about her life, her music. It's amazing, absolutely. fascinating in all sense. When you have the sensibility, of course, I am very fascinated for this way to live and to sense the body, the corporality in piano technique, the use of body, and the personal life. So it's so close to my way of feel a lot of things that, of course, is a discovery, absolute discovery. Actually, now writing on piano technique, it's the problem is not talking about her all the time. For instance, the revision of my book about Beethoven was written before I discovered her. Also, in the first edition, I never mentioned her, of course, as more or less everybody. But in the last edition, in almost every page, I was a good occasion to talk about her. So I stop. Perhaps not too much mentions, but it's so interesting that, and it's a key to explain a lot of other things. That's why in the English edition of my History of Piano Technique, I devoted to her a lot of pages, because it really, there's a lot of things we usually... Chopin was the first to talk... No, Valentine was the first, Chopin was the second. And Liszt was the first using... No, Valentine was the first, and then came... And all that, a lot of things, there are a lot of things we usually said that person was that man, of course, that man was the first, and no, she came.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. In my opinion, it's so fascinating. I could stay here and talk about her until tomorrow, but yeah, really.
Perhaps there's another question here from the public present.
I wanted to ask you, actually, thank you for the fascinating lecture at the concert, but I wanted to ask you about, because in your interpretations of her pieces, you discovered a lot of connections with her biography. That is actually a typical feminine biography of the time. So do you think that in the works of female composers of the time, and particularly female composers connected with piano music, and that was more than a few at the time, do you find a phenomena such as écriture féminine, for example, in literature, some kind of
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. Thanks for the question. First, the most difficult issue here is to talk about feminine as a concept as a whole. In certain way, I'd like to underline the connection between Alain de Montgeroux and her music. And being Alain de Montgeroux, what it means being a woman, and that woman in that period. And that is the same for other persons. So it's obviously in a sub-biased society as ours, it's not the same being a male, being a female, being a man, being a woman. So in my opinion, the most interesting thing is how certain aspects could be stimulating for us to rediscover and to, why not, to perform in certain way, certain pieces. We have a lot of prejudice already formed by the historiography. The idea, for instance, that when we play Beethoven, of course, the fortissimo of Beethoven had to be very fortissimo because Beethoven is a bad character in the story, the fight against destiny, I don't know. So Beethoven. In Schubert, the same fortissimo, perhaps not too much, because Schubert was more singing, more dreamfully, and so what's that? It's not about gender, but it's a bias in the reading, and that it actually influencing our performance, our listening to, how we hear the music, if I would listen to that pieces in certain way. So, for instance, in other women of that time, it's very, very interesting. When you can find, in my opinion, in particular, to me, very interesting, those cases in which I found the opposite of the typical image of the woman as a weak person, as something sweet at the surface of the sensible side of life. But when force and empowerment is a matter of men. So when I find an occasion to rethink this schema that actually is all our culture is full of that. And in that time we have a lot of examples. Alain de Bougereau was not alone. Another an amazing case, a little later, but not too much, is Maria Szymanowska. Maria Szymanowska is another wonderful person. In her case, she had a marriage and sons, and she obtained a divorce in a very difficult situation. In that case, she had obtained to rebuild her life completely with her 3 children, and the short career by Maria Szymanowska as an independent concert player are amazing. When she she pays paintings for the 2 most important painters in Poland, expressly to have a representation, symbolic representation of her power as a composer and as a pianist, and it's so interesting. It's as a modern artist who charge a book or a well oriented website or a photograph that have to give a certain image of her. But it's what's very, very, very new. There is no example before that. She was inventing the promotion, self-promotion, and her image as a beautiful, powerful woman who has the power of her life. And it was the reflect of her personal life. And in music too, because she had a very big man, a big hands, for instance. And in her pieces of that short life she had, there are a lot of passages in which it's almost impossible to play as written, but she was able to play that. So she was the point of the I am able to play that, and so this kind of proud of the unicity and the power of her. So I love that. I love this kind of this way to be a woman. In a man, perhaps, is quite disturbing this attitude, but in a woman, it's reshaping the balance of the society. So there is a completely different thing, and I love that. That's why I don't like so much the Clara Schumann, Clara Wieck, because Clara Wieck embodies the opposite, the acceptation of the structure of the society. She was the widow, the performer who renounced her career as a composer, and always in the remembrance of the great genius she had, the privilege to know and to have wife of, etc. And that's why I don't like so much the example of Clara Schumann, and that's why I talk about other ways to be a woman in that time. There's another person very interesting, Marie Bigot. It's a very with an compositional output too short, but even in that case, very interesting. Not so as interesting as Alain de Bougereau, but anyway, we have a lot of interesting pianists, composers offer an image of a different way to be a woman in that society.
I have a question of my own and a question by Mario Suominen, who was asking first.
Of course.
I now would like to know whether Hélène de Montgeroux has written about performance practice.
Yes, we just have the treatise, the school pour l'enseignement, but the treatise is very interesting because it has a lot of text, not just the pieces, and it's the long introduction is a very outstanding introduction, overall introduction about piano playing, and then there's some interesting issues about. She was the first person, for instance, to play about talk about more details. But for instance, she's the first to register this change about the speed of the andantes. The andante was a very fast movement in 19th century, and we usually play the andantes very slow, but there's a huge mistake in performance practice, even in early music, not so well changed actually. But in the end, she is talking about nowadays, especially in Germany, we andantes are being played slower and slower. So it's very interesting, this kind of attention to today, what is happening today. So that is it's a very interesting woman but it's just one source. So we just have what she published in that source. It's absolutely interesting, etude after etude, with all these introductions that are mainly about piano practice, the execution in the biomechanical sense, but very often there's some interesting observation about other things. But in particular, in the first volume, in the introduction, in the first, there are some very interesting details. Actually, no, it's not as the Hummel's or Czerny's treatise that were absolutely a full, comprehensive description of how people played that time. Actually, very personal, this treatise. There is a lot of observations that clearly her proposal, her approach, and she was a very specific person. Even the post at the conservatoire, she taught there 2 years and a half, just that, and after that she renounced and preferred to grow up her son and devote herself perhaps to composition, perhaps to social life, perhaps to improvisation, and due that economically revolution that was not easy, but after that more or less she was upper class, so more or less it was not, she doesn't need too much learning. So
and now to my own question. Before, I would like to thank you very, very much for this inspiring lecture, concert, and congratulate you. And now, I assume the treatise was published back then. Is it available now?
Yes, more or less complete, because what is available in Petrucci IMSP is a apparently complete version of the treatise, but actually some pages are lost. Is the digitalization of the Gallica of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and it's incomplete. So it was just few pages, but not to all the pages, and have been a big effort to find the remaining pages. I have the other ones, but thanks to several people, but through Esther Vela, the teacher of the at the Brook Conservatory. That is a very interesting pianist and researcher, very devoted to Narcisa Freixas in particular, the Spanish composer, the Catalan piano teacher and composer, but also very interested in all this, and I appreciate very much her help to have these remaining pieces. Among what this amazing etude in '92, but it's absolutely incredible. So I love it. So a piece in 1816 that begins here that way. I thought, so because this is my favorite chord in the world. Yeah. This is my favorite chord. But anyway, it seemed like incredible. This piece, these 292, for instance, is lost. Just the first piece, the first page, but in the rest of the.
Okay. So, if there are no more questions, no.
If I may,
of course.
Short question.
Of course.
You mentioned that she was a very good improviser, and it's something surprising to me to get to know that were the really successful female improviser, because I know that, for example, to another very powerful woman of the time, Louise Farrenc, that was a very good composer and recognized. That what stopped her to be admired by the public was that the practice, like the performance practice of the time, included a very strong theatric aspect. Like it had to be with a lot of expression, a lot of gestures, and for the women it was not well seen, and it was difficult to her to cope with this.
Absolutely, but Louise Farrenc is not the same generation and that is very, very important, because as I explained in my in my lessons here in the ESMUC, we have usually we have an image about 19th century, very often quite confused or very generic. And in particular, both the role of woman within the musical scene and the role of the relationship between improvisation, composition, and performance within the same musical scene changed a lot along the century. At the beginning of the 19th century, for women was not so difficult being an improviser, composer, and performer. 30, 40 years later was much more difficult for her, for the women being an improviser, and in particular being a composer. At the same time, improvisation in itself was changing her role, because improvisation disappeared from the scene. Even Chopin, after just improvised in her 20s. In her 30s and in 40s, he never improvised in public. At least there's no mention to improvisation of Liszt after 1845. So they were big improvisers, but even then, these great men, famous, and even then, the improvisation disappeared from the... And it's a very good, interesting debate. In musicology, contemporary musicology, there is a very interesting debate about why disappeared musical. Dana Guley, one of my most favorite musicologists, published 2 years before an amazing book about that, proposing a very new explanation about why improvisation disappeared from the public scene. Usual idea was the superiority of the written work, because the written work was more important, and it seems to have a bigger image because it was not so ephemeral, not so. But actually, his explanation is quite different, and for me was very, very stimulating. And that's actually very, very interesting. Today, musicological debate about improvisation, because there is a lot of different pieces over there. And for women, the point was that step by step, each decade is even clearer that the role of women, subordinate role of women within the bourgeois society, was associated with the idea of women as interpreter, as in performers, as interpreter actually of the, but the power of creation is a matter of male. So composition has to be a matter of for male people, just for men, and that is what is step by step the path of the 19th century. But the century did not begin that way. At the beginning, it was very, very different. Actually, for Hélène Montgeroux was not a matter of as a woman she was not able to compose, or she was as a composer has not the credibility or what. No, she had not this, but she was born in 1764. She was a 18th century woman. That's why it's so incredible, her music, because it's so old. But for someone as Luis Farang, who could be her niece or her grandchild, granddaughter, obviously the situation was different. And she had at least the backing of her husband, at least. Because for other person was even worse.
We could go on and on, listening to you, but unfortunately we have to close now. This third wonderful session. Thank you so much, Luca.
It has been a pleasure. My pleasure. Even in this so hot ambience, but it's very difficult to play with
in all senses.
This temperature. I don't know, 35 degrees.
I would only like to reply to your observation about you being no specialist in musical signification.
No, absolutely, I'm not a specialist.
It reminded me of one of the definitions that I find most appealing of what musical signification is. And with that, we could close the session. And it's Gravot's Marta's definition. She said musical signification can be understood as the wisdom that performers carry with them, whether it is in a conscious or unconscious way. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very fitting for this evening's experiences tonight. So, thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for coming live here. Some of you from far away. It was a great pleasure. And I do hope we will all meet in June next year, live. And we'll continue these interesting conversations about music and meaning.
Hopefully.
Thank you very much to you all.
Thank you all.